When we begin to contemplate the mystery of value, perhaps we ought to pause for a second and consider words in the light of value. We have a wonder world of words, and many that we use every day could help us a great deal to understand the essential meanings of the things that happen to us and the circumstances which we transmit by means of word patterns and structures. For example, we have a word, liberal. Now, most persons like to be regarded as liberals. This may mean, politically, generous-mindedness. The individual has escaped from extreme conservatism and belongs rather to a democratic than an autocratic concept of living. The word liberal also suggests liberal-mindedness in other ways, generosity of attitude, magnanimity of conduct, sharing readily what we have with others. Liberal is a word we like to think about, and very few persons would resent being called liberal in some way, although like most semantic terms, it has now developed some specialized meanings on which there is no general accord. But what does the word actually mean? And when we go to that, perhaps we drop out of the familiar. The word comes, of course, from the Latin liberalis, and it simply meant, originally, not a slave. Now that is an interesting concept, a free man. It had really nothing to do with what you thought. It had to do with what you were. Now, if you were free, you had certain privileges under Roman law. And if you were free, there were certain trades and crafts and professions that you could engage in, which was not permissible to a person not free, or a bondsman, or perhaps, in the broadest speaking, a slave. A free man, for example, was permitted as a distinction, as an indication that he was free. He was permitted to train his mind. This was something that was discouraged in the slave at that time. So there was a line drawn which we would rather hate to think of today, but perhaps it won't hurt us. All such arts and crafts as resulted in profit only could be indulged in by slaves. But any art or craft which led to the improvement of consciousness could only be indulged in by a free man. Therefore, a liberal meant a liberated person. And as a reward of liberation, he was entitled to be educated in such forms of knowledge as improved character rather than increased estate. Now, on that basis, what's happened to liberal? It's sort of gotten mixed up. If a person, by one of many circumstances, and the Romans kept the gate of liberty rather widely ajar, if for any reason a person became a free man, he might, by this circumstance alone, achieve to that which probably was the greatest thing in the world for him. He could become a thinker. Today, the moment we get free from responsibility of any kind, we stop thinking. Thoughts are for people in trouble. Thoughts are something that should be used only on rare occasions. And it's quite possible that even slaves used them as often as we do. But certainly we do not recognize liberty, derived from the same word, to simply mean the right to improve ourselves. Today we interpret this term largely as the right to luxury, the right to be considered as good as anybody else, in our own estimation a little better. It is the right to have what we want. It is the right of free enterprise. It has very little to do with the ancient meaning that it was the right to grow. Now, when a man was free, he was permitted to indulge in the studies of what are now called the liberal arts. Now, liberal art simply means an art that a free man could practice. That is exactly what it meant to the Roman. Therefore, the liberal arts were those which were permissible to any person born free or who had attained freedom by any of the various courses open under Roman law. Liberal arts, then, were not liberal-minded arts or generous arts. They were arts for free men. And these arts included, in the Roman concept of things, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were the liberal arts. And when we get a Bachelor of Arts today in a university, it is presumed that we have qualified in some program bearing upon the arts that were open to free men. This sort of carries into our general thinking value. Here is an expression of a meaning of value, which we may not generally consider. We value liberty. And this means, actually, that we value the right to devote a major part of our lives to study and self-improvement. That by circumstances which are equivalent to freedom, but circumstances often which we have to earn for ourselves, the individual, through his labor, earns the right to unfold his own consciousness. He has a body which will always be a bondsman, because the very concerns of the body are the concerns of those that are not free. Man who is in slavery to his own body is also a bondsman. But the individual who has a life in consciousness apart from body, that man is free. And this is the message of the Word, which we have called liberal. And it gives us a very good concept in relationship to Shabuhi, or this kihin that we talked about earlier. This problem of moral beauty, this problem of adorning the life with the ornaments of cultural attainment. We want to live as far as we can in this world graciously. We want to live beautifully. We want to live in an atmosphere that is compatible with peace of mind and serenity of spirit. To achieve this end, we must perform some action that is apt or likely to result in the state of consciousness which we desire. We all know that a life undisciplined, undirected, and uncontrolled seldom attains any enduring value. It does not have pleasantness of years. It does not give us freedom from the importuning circumstances of the day. It does not give us happiness or contentment or peace of mind. Therefore, a life of value must be so controlled and directed that it becomes a valuable life. A life not only valuable to ourselves, but a life valuable to others. For we are never really happy unless we are doing something that is really meaningful. Any other form of recreation is rather hollow before we finish with it all. How to achieve, then, a life of value? Our great problem today is complication. The life of value must be a simple life. Now, a simple life in our generation and in our Western civilization is rather difficult to envision. We are actually born with a sense of tension and confusion hanging over us. We live every day and hour in the midst of sound and fury. For us to achieve natural simplicity, to be able to have quietude of consciousness, just seems about impossible. Yet it is not as impossible or as difficult as we would first imagine. The natural beginnings of a life of value include the decision to cling to value, to make some compromise of some nature with materiality, by means of which it is not all possessing, by which it is not all dominating in our experience and in our way of living. Happiness arises very largely from our ability to appreciate simple, natural, and gracious things. Happiness is not very often to be associated with the gratification of elaborate tastes. Happiness is appreciation. It is the recognition of the dignity of the available. It is not this headlong dash after the unattained. The life of value is the life that is immediately lived with a sense of value. A life that is valuable every moment because we are continually experiencing something of importance. To achieve this level, therefore, we must be ever watchful for value. We must seek value in everything that happens, for value is there. And as we are able to take problems and transmute them into value, the problem itself grows less and the value grows greater. We are all constantly in the midst of valuable experience, but for the most part we do not benefit by it, nor are we grateful for it. We are usually most grateful for that which is least valuable. We are not glad because we remember, we are glad because we forget. We do not live with the constant attention and responsiveness to that which is fine or proper or noble or beautiful. Yet we have the faculties which enable us to live this way, and we know that other persons have achieved it. We also realize that what we call aesthetic value has been associated with art. But we are further aware that many artists never possess it. That many artists are simply craftsmen who are able by some mechanical ingenuity in themselves to create harmonious designs, and yet whose lives are not harmonious, and whose actual personal existence is heavily plagued with the same problems as the less artistic. Therefore, skill in art is not necessarily a guarantee of value. Nowhere do we find, in any institution that we have created, anything which guarantees the transmission of value. We may give our lives to religion, and we may really very seriously work with the subject, and yet we may come to the end of our days without ever having been religious. We may give our lives to philosophy, and yet at the end of our life again, we die unphilosophically. Thus, we cannot assume that any system will automatically and inevitably bestow value. Value in every instance is something that we must contribute. We might say something like a problem in music. We go to a great concert. There is a fine orchestra and a leading conductor. The compositions that are played are by master composers. The entire occasion exposes us to a great deal of musical sublimity. I remember distinctly attending a concert in which, among other things, there was a marvelous rendition of parts of the opera Siegfried. One scene being, of course, the casting of the great sword, Nothung. And this was not really dramatized, but it was sung out well with a few gestures, and the artist turned in a very adequate performance. When it was all over, a man sitting near to me observed in a stage whisper to someone next to him, "Thank God that blacksmith has stopped." That's all it meant. There was just simply no sense of the importance of music. The individual was exposed, but it didn't take. And when we are exposed to bacteria, it nearly always does take. But when we are exposed to culture, we seem to have an extraordinary degree of immunity. This situation shows that culture, that value cannot be simply bestowed by one who possesses it. If value could be bestowed, religion would have saved the world thousands of years ago, philosophy would have brought us to the golden age, and even the greatest advancements in science couldn't cripple us too much. We would be with some security. But it just is not to be communicated in this way. Value, therefore, must always involve the power of the person to recognize the valuable, to give something of himself to the compound of the circumstance that arises, so that there is a sympathy, a blending of understandings, a meeting of minds or of hearts. For without the appreciation of the person, value cannot perform its perfect work. Now, appreciation is another thing, which is a word much used, but not too well understood or applied. To appreciate something, we must understand. Appreciation must follow some inward experience of our own. We cannot appreciate unless that which we appreciate is to a measure able to reach us as living persons and touch us and do something to us. We may say, therefore, with the Neoplatonists, that value is the result of something that is valuable, receiving to itself the instinct of value in us. We must move out to embrace the valuable. We must have an instinctive skill, an instinctive and insatiable appetite, which can never be satisfied except when it reaches and takes hold of value. If we work upon the problem in this way, we also gradually come to the principles of the simplification of things. The value consciousness in man does not rejoice in the elaborate or the complicated or the grandiose. Man himself is by nature a simple creature, and complication rests uncomfortably upon him at all times, leading to confusion and discord. The natural human instinct is for the simple, the immediate, and the immanent. We like value that is understandable, and it must be simple if we are to understand it. If then we are in the presence of the grand, we are overawed. We are impressed. But it is as though we were seated before more food than we could eat, and having made gluttons of ourselves, find only discomfiture. True value has to be something that nourishes without overdoing this process of nutrition. That is why we have to use some instrument by which we can measure value and discover it in our own lives. The greatest exponents of this concept of value that we know have been the Oriental peoples, especially those who lived a rather simple and severe kind of life. Great students of art today, for example, look upon the arts of China. They look back into the pre-Christian period. They look back into the great dynasties that gave the world Confucius and Lao Tzu, and even further back into the long, mysterious shadows of the Shang dynasty, a dynasty which has only but slightly appeared historically, and is mostly wrapped in that strange oblivion which hides the origins of things. But out of this very early period has come some marvelous artifacts, magnificent pieces of bronze, wonderful fragments of ancient stone carving, simple, austere, plain, but magnificent of line, a clean, wonderful, immediate grasp of value. Somewhere back in those days, there were great artists. Perhaps in those times they did not even know they were great artists. One a well-known expert in Chinese art tried to explain it, and he said we can come to only one conclusion, that those people back there were great because they had not been taught not to be great. They hadn't been ruined. Those artisans never went to school, even a school of art. They did not learn to draw. They did not belong to a tradition. We do not know how they worked. Perhaps by themselves, perhaps under some small guild or clan, but certainly nothing had interfered with their natural creativity. They proved to us beyond doubt that man anciently knew what was good, whether he knew that he knew or not. Probably he did not know. But he was a simple person, and he made something, and he looked at it, and he said, I don't like it. So he tossed it on the rubbish heap. A little later he made something else, looked at that for a while, showed it to a few of his friends, and he said, I do like it. Therefore he kept it. This was what we might term higher criticism. This was the way it was when the individuals simply felt what was right and felt what was wrong. So we come down through the great days of Chinese art, and we come down maybe to the three dynasties, or we come to the beginning of the great Wei cycle of art, which arose from the Han and dominated Chinese culture in the opening centuries of the Christian era. Here we find still the marvelous simplicity, the wonderful massing of design, the total lack of detail, the perfect shaping of things, the perfect sense of rightness, where even looking at it now with all that we know, we couldn't improve on it. For some unknown reason and by some mystery, the old artist put each area which he specialized exactly where it most belonged. It couldn't be anywhere else and be right. And then we go on a little further, and gradually we see the rise of the Tang dynasty around the 6th century. And here we begin to see still many great things, but something that indicates loss. In the beginning of the Tang, something happened to Chinese art. The robes got too many folds in them. The stones had too many figures on them. The inscriptions became too flowery. The massing was no longer the strange, severe, marvelous simplicity of ancient days. It is not remarkable then that the masters of the Tang dynasty began to copy the older pieces. And later the masters of the Sung, who got worse still, began copying the Tang. Anything to find a purity, to get back to something else. For by the Sung dynasty, things were getting pretty badly cluttered. And by the days of the Ming, which was a very long dynasty, which progressively decreased in value, we really were in a situation that was just about as tragic as the problem of art during the reigns of the Louis of France. In the Ming, everything was overdone. All of the great line was gone. Paint and color and inlay began to appear. And a little later, in the Qing, we just went completely crazy. And China's art fell apart. Little by little, over a period of time, it got worse and worse and worse. Why did this happen? It apparently happened because somewhere man began to cater to something beside his own instincts. Perhaps he catered to profit, and perhaps he tried to please ambitious, luxury-loving rulers. Perhaps tastes became more complicated as they grew more decadent. But physical luxury, the rise of a great aristocracy, seemed to destroy the integrity of primitive art. Men began to buy things because they were expensive, or to make things because they were profitable, and instantly culture began to fade. So in our search for value, we see everywhere in art that the great art that is most collected today by great critics and great connoisseurs is early, back in the time when men made simple forms that refresh the spirit. And even today, as we touch them, we feel a tremendous benevolent influence. But little by little, this influence is lost through the complicating processes of society. All this simply points out that with the rise of luxury and complexity, value diminishes. And with the loss of value comes the loss of culture, comes the decline of liberties, comes the end of respects and honors. And the simple code that Confucius and Mencius taught in China 2,400 years ago or more has ceased. The simple dignities of life are gone. And gradually China came into the terrible condition which afflicted it in the opening years of the present century. A condition which undoubtedly precipitated the tragic condition which we now know as China. So we need this sense of the simplicity, the search for the simple thing. The Chinese simplicity was shifted to Japan. And while Japan gradually became more and more influenced by Tang and Sung and Ming art from China, the people of Japan were just a little different in nature. They had another religion which helped them out, and that was Shinto. And Shinto was a religion of austerity. It wasn't a religion of self-sacrifice or martyrdom or self-denial, but it was a religion which preached the value of nature. That nothing that man could ever do would be as beautiful as a natural thing which creation had done for him. That all the works of art could scarcely equal a tree. And that man everywhere found his most perfect expression by adjusting himself to nature and becoming, in a sense, sensitive to the universal order of things. That this was far more important than building a great superficial culture of his own. As a result, the quality of Shibui has definitely lingered there, although with a little longer contact with the West, their culture will probably collapse also, because they are moving gradually onto an efficiency basis. And efficiency is apparently the end of culture. And to a measure, as we know it today, efficiency is the end of comfort and convenience, because we become so obsessed with certain processes that we can no longer enjoy life even with comforts, which other people have never had. So our life of value has something to do with simplicity and the appreciation of simplicity. So we can start studying this in our own particular environment. I would suggest that sometime, as we recommended before, that each of you try to make a sumi drawing, or to make it the simplest possible thing, use a blank piece of paper and a ballpoint pen. Take 5 simple lines, or simple form line structures. Make a little design on a piece of paper in which you place 5 lines in what you regard as harmonic relationship with each other. Use a straight line and a curve and perhaps a broken line. Make a little design of 5 lines, something you would like to think as a picture. Try and draw a tree with 5 lines. Hokusai, the great Japanese artist, in his manga, his textbook, drew hundreds of bird forms, each one of these with 1 line only. Now there is perfect economy. And yet each of these 1-line birds is a real bird, a delightful thing. If we went after that, we would make 500 fussy little lines, rub 2/3 of them out and start over again, and end up by throwing the whole business in the wastebasket. That is the way we would approach it. But make a little drawing of 3 or 4 lines and just say to yourself, relax, and then say to yourself, do I like it? Is this little sketch well balanced? Is it nice? Is it really good? And in the most cases, if we're honest, we'll realize that we don't operate with much of that quality we associate with Leonardo da Vinci. The 5-line drawing will not be tremendous. The bird won't look exactly like a bird. We won't be too happy over it. We may wonder for a moment that we did as well as we could, but a little later we'll find we could do better if we really put our hearts and minds on it. But see if you, in some simple thing, can actually create a simple form of some kind that looks sufficient to your consciousness. Try a little flower arrangement. That's very easy here in California. Take a small, simple, plain bowl. Remember that you are not going to use the bowl to be impressive. You're not going to say people are going to look at it because the bowl costs $20. The bowl should cost 10 or 15 cents, maybe 50 cents if you get real opulent. But certainly it should cost 50 cents or no more. Maybe at the moment the prices will be inflated. But it should be very simple. The bowl should do nothing but not interfere. In it you arrange a half a dozen flowers or leaves, buds, branches, twigs, anything that pleases you. Arrange it as nicely as you can. Put it by itself on a little stand where you can look at it without seeing anything else. It's not really very attractive to catch a whole group of fleur-de-lis in the wallpaper behind it. Just put it someplace where it is plain. Sit back and say, would you like to live with it? I suspect that you will creep away and the arrangement will disappear as soon as possible. You won't really like to live with it. You will find that it doesn't really please you. something's wrong with it. You look at a book and maybe where some Japanese have made some flower arrangements, you say, mine doesn't look like that. Anything they do seems to be right. Anything I do seems to be wrong. This is an important discovery. This is the beginning of a quest for value. What did you do that was wrong? Or as you go along, if you find an arrangement which by intent or circumstance happened to be good, what did you do that was right? How do you proceed with this so that you finally reach a condition in which you say, this pleases me? This fulfills something. I have expressed beauty and I know it. There's no way of finding out except to try. Now, there are many other ways in which we also try to express beauty. In many countries, this expression is instinctive. All you have to do is give the individual the materials and he will do it. In this country, that type of expression is not natural. It is not instinctive. It's something that you have to more or less discipline yourself to appreciate. Yet this discipline is the basis of moral control of life. All good things for Western man begin with self-discipline. And the reason why it is so necessary is because Western man has never permitted himself to obey cheerfully. He has always regarded leadership as his divine right, and that others should obey him. We have not learned the dignity and importance of obeying law or obeying principles, or recognizing that we live in a universe in which certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And it is up to us to find out what is right and do that. This kind of thinking is not natural to our tastes. We have to acquire it in some way. The beginning of all acquirement is interest. If we don't want to acquire, we never will. If we want to, this desire must be warmed until it leads us to an action that will further the desire. Now, every person, as we have said in other talks of this series, is in need of value at the present time. And in the Oriental mind, value is very close to meditation. Value is a rapport. It is an experience. It is something that makes life richer and better and more gracious for us. Value is always the doing of the small thing beautifully. It is the recognition of the dignity of detail. Not to cover a thing with details, but to discover the importance of the small actions which make up life, the small decisions which each one of us must face. One of the most annoying things that some people experience, for example, in Japan, is the insistent habit the Japanese people have of bowing over the telephone. This, to us, is just carrying it all just a little too far. But a long-distance conversation may be considerably longer in time than in distance. By the time each individual has greeted the other person and bowed 8 or 10 times in front of the telephone, the 3 minutes is well more than up. And no one has gotten around to the conversation yet. Now, if you told these people that bowing over the telephone really wasn't quite necessary, they would agree with you. But to bow has been part of their lives for thousands of years. It has been innate in them to pay tribute to the dignity and the life and heart of another person. The other person, of course, is returning it with interest. This bowing is a mass of mutual admiration. Perhaps they've forgotten what it means, but they've never forgotten to do it. They've never forgotten this peculiar little niceness, which we would have absolutely no time for. Well, there's no reason why we should, in the West, the way we think and live, take time for it. We just simply move on to things. But something is lost. Perhaps in the process of this bowing, which in itself is perhaps only a minor form of exercise, there is something else involved. Perhaps this little pause gives us a chance to organize our own consciousness a little better. Perhaps if we bowed 10 times over the phone ourselves, we wouldn't say some of the things we say over the phone. Nor would we be utterly unreasonable and tie up a party line when there's a sick child in someone else's family, which happened not long ago here, and the child died. We wouldn't be this way if in some mysterious manner these little courtesies were alive. These little courtesies are kihing, moral value. They mean that everything we do in life, we do with thoughtfulness. And the moment we do things with thoughtfulness, mysterious values open up that we wouldn't otherwise ever notice. The life that's lived in haste is always a life that misses value. We mentioned a moment ago the great Japanese woodblock artist Hokusai. In the course of his career, when he was over 70 years old, he did his wonderful group of woodcut drawings of Mount Fuji. Fuji-san, or Mr. Fuji, is to the Japanese the supreme mountain, the mysterious symbol of absolute aesthetic excellence. The extraordinary symmetry of the cone is certainly well known all over the world. But Hokusai made a whole collection of prints upon the leitmotif of Fuji. It ran through every one of them, and he contrived countless ways to show the mountain in the midst of other situations. One scene, we see the peak through a spider's web, and a leaf has fallen on the web. In another view, we see the peak reflected on the surface of the tea in an elderly gentleman's teacup. In another scene, we see a man making a barrel, and we see Fuji through the open end of the barrel. It comes to us from behind groups of parasols drying in the sun. It stands alone in solemn grandeur in the midst of rain that seems to cover it and haze it with shadow. It also is seen through the loop of a great wave, the spray of which is changing into little birds that fly away. Everywhere this mountain comes back, simply because to this artist, this mountain was absolutely Shibuya. It was the highest, most perfect controlled thing he could conceive of. And in art, he could not think of a symbol that to him carried with it such extraordinary beauty. So there are parties in Japan still every year. Groups go out and spend the day Fuji viewing. This is enough. They take lunch, write poetry, and look at the mountains. This is happiness. This is peace. This is contentment. We couldn't do so well with a $5,000 car and a $500 outlay for the afternoon. To them, there is a certain refreshment from nature, a refreshment from man taking into himself the majesty of the universe. And this is important to the life of value. The life of value which must begin to be taught to children, where things seen are not just things, but they are living symbols of universal principles. They make us feel better. They give us new dedications and new consecrations. They make us more friendly, and they overcome the tendency to insomnia and nervous tension with which we are afflicted. To live in the light of value, therefore, means simply to allow the light of the sun to strike things and reveal them. The 7th and 8th century Buddhist artists frequently represented the figure of the Buddha Amida as a sunrise coming over the mountains. This great haloed head arising between the great peaks of hills, and the light of the nimbus shining down and touching the rocks and the trees and the river and the waterfall. All of these things moving gradually into visibility in the light of Amita's radiance. Amita simply represents the internal consciousness of man. And as the light of this consciousness shines out, it touches all the darkness, not physical darkness, but aesthetic darkness, with which our lives are burdened. And in the light of this inner illumination, everything becomes beautiful. And this beauty moves and changes with the light, until finally the full radiance of the majesty of high noon exposes the full picture. So this sense of allowing the light in the self to bring out the shapes and forms and patterns of natural beauty, this was distinctly an Asiatic concept. Westerns have had it, but not to any great degree. In the West, we have considered art as belonging to artists. In the East, it is considered that art is absolutely necessary to rich and poor, educated and uneducated, that every human being has a life in art, and that to discover this and to live according to it is to have a full life that is not dependent for its fullness upon what we have, but upon the continual expansion of what we are. To live a life in value or in the light of value has certain compensations. And we find this type of thinking in another Oriental artist, Hiroshige. Hiroshige, as far as we can learn, was simply what was called in Japan in his time a Yedo man. He was an artist in Tokyo, no better and no worse than his contemporaries as far as his personal life was concerned. And after he had lived a fair life as a very great artist and an interesting, informal, friendly human being, a life, incidentally, which was heavily burdened with poverty and other limitations of a world in transition, because he flourished at a time when the old Japanese economy was falling apart. But in any event, Hiroshige had a life in value. And his value was that he could go out along the Tokaido, the great road that led from Yedo to Kyoto, and he could stop anywhere along the road and see great beauty. He could take any step of this incredible journey from one great city to another. He could pause anywhere, frame it with a scratch pad, and in a few seconds, every scene was magnificent. He wasn't always superlative, but in every series of his great paintings, there were masterpieces. And these masterpieces were based upon the most simple themes. Two peasants hastening home across a bridge in the rain. Someone sitting down, warming himself on by a fire along the side of a road. Always, however, he captured an exquisite composition, simply because he was conscious of it. To him, everything became a picture, and every picture was beautiful. Well, some of us have this picture-making propensity also, but when we want to make a record of the Tokaido today, we would just use a camera. We'd never draw it ourselves. And incidentally, as several people have pointed out, it's hard to get a good picture along the Tokaido today because you're going by at 60 miles an hour. Of course you won't get a picture. You won't get any kihine out of life by these two procedures. First, rushing across the scenery, or today above it at 600 miles an hour, or trying to preserve the record of beauty with a camera. Cameras have their place, no one denies it. But somehow, it's when you sit quietly by the road with the sketch pad and create. You always make a few little differences. The camera is not the same as a great artist. A good artist can get much more from a camera. But somehow, great art has a little tendency to simplify, to make certain minor changes that bring a pattern into particular harmony, to convey the true impression, which perhaps some accidental circumstance has distorted. But you have to have this slow journey through beauty in order to pause long enough to be touched by it, to be moved into some maturity of consciousness. Before Hiroshige died, he pointed out, he said that he was fortunate that the length of his life had been equal to the stations of the Tokaido. In other words, he likened the journey of life to the trip from Yedo to Kyoto. That in these way stations, these little inns where men stop to rest, all the way along this road with its wonderful changing scenery, its little villages, its meetings of sea and mountain, its ancient temples, its wayside shrines, and every so often a little monument standing there, perhaps to Jizo, the protector of little children, or perhaps simply a monument that says, "We do not know who passed this way, but God bless them." Now, there's something rather charming about all that, and we just have hastened ourselves out of it. Now, no one says we can settle down and make that marvelous journey along the Tokaido from here to Pasadena. That is not the thing we're trying to bring home. But what we are trying to bring home is that man, even though he must adapt his daily life very largely to the pressures of his time, he can take certain time out of his life, if he wants to make these quiet little journeys in consciousness, if they carry him only in his mind along some pleasant road. There is always time for the little journey in the self, the little thought into a better world. There is always time to reflect upon what appears to be a rather crude and unpleasant circumstance, and suddenly see it as Hiroshige might have seen it, a thing of great beauty. Or as Hokusai painted Fuji, one day in great storm, one day in great eruption, one time when floods are tearing down the sides of it, but with it all, its sublimity unchanged. So there are always ways we can get inside of things and back of them and make them more valuable to us as spiritual experience. And I have always believed that this kind of an approach is easier, more gracious, and more natural than this desperate effort to be good, which has deformed people since the beginning of history. There is nothing that is more miserable than a person making a valiant effort to be good. And very seldom does this misery suffer alone. It nearly always involves other people, until finally the whole community wishes that there was no more goodness for these people to try to imitate. If instead of that attitude we did have more of this concept of graciousness, of value, we would quietly achieve good without being noticeably obnoxious in the procedure. We would find that our consciousness was maturing without inhibition, without frustration. We would see that we are becoming better people, not because we are trying to be good, but simply because we are trying to understand values. We are trying to make use of the faculties with which we have been endowed. And if we use the faculties well, we will be good, in the truest sense of the word. We will not be trying to assume virtues, we will be experiencing them. And in so doing, will enrich our own lives and enrich the lives of others, instead of becoming a nuisance to all concerned. So in this process of value, of moral value, of living of it, I think we should try with all the simple things at our disposal. One thing that we have learned in the West, and are beginning to realize more than ever before, is that haste does not mean the good use of time. Today, haste is one of the most expensive habits we have ever developed. Haste costs us more than we possibly save. It means things poorly done. It means inadequate workmanship and craftsmanship. Things fall apart. Haste is not a saving, it is a wasting. And in personal living, this is also true. The individual who is constantly, desperately hurrying in order that he may get more into his life is accomplishing the exact opposite result. The more he hastens, the less there is in his life. Though we may say that we don't want to spend hours and hours at tasks that do not require that length of time. At tasks, no. But at meaning, how better can we spend the time? What are we going to do with this time that we have so desperately saved? At the expense of quality, at the expense of thought, and expense of meaning in everything. We're going to sit down in front of a television and watch several people bombard each other at close range. This is about all we're going to do. We're not going to do anything important. We're not hastening because we expect to change the course of history when we get through with the present job. We are hastening because we are moving from one boring situation into another. So why not pause and give the thing a little greater thought? Actually, people in crafts and trades who are more or less experienced have realized that quiet, methodical work is the quickest. That things done well do not have to be done again. That things done thoughtfully become joys in themselves. Thus we must break down a psychological barrier between what is enjoyable and what is drudgery. Today, to most people, anything they have to do is